Shalom! Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines Jewish Community Relations Council, and also by Dr. Daniel Reynolds of Grinnell College. And Dr. Reynolds, it's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, about what you do.
Sure. I am a professor of German at Grinnell College. I've been teaching there for the past 16 years, and I teach everything about German, as do my colleagues, from beginning level of language through advanced studies in German culture and history. And my research is focused currently on the topic of Holocaust tourism. So it's a topic that's I share with my students also, but it's in many ways it's quite a departure from where my training is in German studies. It's the focus of this research is not German literature. I've come to it through a very indirect route, but it's something that has sustained me for quite some time now.
Dan, thank you, by the way, for your participation with the Iowa Council for Holocaust Education.
Thank you, Mark.
You add a lot of information there for us. When did you first get interested in the Holocaust as a topic?
I think as a topic, I mean, I have to say, long ago, I think even as a high school student, my father was in the military, and we were stationed overseas in Belgium. And I think for me, one of the more formative experiences I had was a visit to the concentration camp of Breendonk, north of Brussels. And that began kind of this process of thinking about the Holocaust and encounters with survivors of the Holocaust. The tour guide was a survivor, and I think that was the beginning of a long process of inquiry. But more recently, the interest was sparked by an effort by myself and several colleagues at Grinnell College to develop a curriculum in genocide studies at Grinnell College. And at the time, I was studying the genocide, the 1904 genocide by the German colonial troops in Southwest Africa of the Herero and Nama people. And it is sort of through the study of that genocide that I've then became interested in the study of in the Holocaust and its memorialization. So my route here is fairly circuitous, but it's long-standing.
What was the first of the Holocaust memorials that you had ever seen?
I think the first Holocaust memorial that I ever saw was, I would say, I mean, the Washington, D.C. Museum, when it was brand new, was the first site that was dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust that I remember seeing. I've been traveling to Germany and Berlin for many years and was aware of various smaller scale memorials, but I think Germany has, and Berlin in particular, has been creating new, very large scale memorial spaces dedicated to the Holocaust. So I've been, I think, for the last 20 years or so, those have been part of the focus of my interest.
What do you see in Germany? What are they doing? What are those memorials like?
They are fascinating. They are, I mean, to back up a little bit, Berlin has plenty of Holocaust memorials. And of course, one has to, what counts as a Holocaust memorial. So Berlin is the site of the perpetrators. And I think the memorial sites of Berlin tend to commemorate the sites of perpetration, perhaps the most notorious among them being the House of the Wannsee Conference. But there are also more memorials to the victims, to Berlin's Jewish community, the ruins of the new synagogue in Berlin, for example. But since reunification, so for the last 20 plus years in Germany, there has been a concerted effort to commemorate the Holocaust in the center of Berlin, which had previously been no man's land, between the area between East and West Berlin. And it was a barren wasteland during the period of division. And in recent years, we've had the installation of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, just south of the Brandenburg Gate, very large-scale, massive landscape of concrete pillars in the middle of the city, Not too far from that is the Topography of Terror, which is the grounds where many of the agencies that were affiliated with the Holocaust had their agencies, their administrative headquarters. So the SS, the Gestapo, and so on. And Germany has unearthed that terrain and built a information center there. And not too far from there is Daniel Liebeskind's new Jewish Museum in Berlin, which is an amazing structure, an example of fascinating development in architecture, but also an effort by Berlin to commemorate the Jewish life that once thrived in the city.
Now, who's he?
Liebeskind is also, he is a Polish-born American Jewish architect who is also, at the World Trade Center, drafted the originally winning proposal for the new World Trade Center building, and whose design came up with the 1,776 feet. But his most famous, that design was ultimately not the one that carried through. But his building in Berlin is world renowned, and it's an example of the difficulty, the challenges, and I think in some ways also the successes that Berlin faces in memorializing the Holocaust. The struggles between remembering the Jewish community that once thrived there, the acknowledging the loss, not celebrating the deeds of the perpetrators, but at the same time educating about the deeds of the perpetrators. So there has come in Berlin in particular, there has arisen what some are calling a memorial district in the heart of the city. And its primary focus is on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And that's an interesting constellation in terms of how Germans now think of themselves in a post-unification world.
Now, at least the memorial near the Brandenburg Gate is abstract. What role does abstraction have to play in any of this?
This is the memorial designed by Peter Eisenman is considered an example of the counter monument. So if you think of traditional monuments as being national sites of commemoration, often celebration, but often mourning as well, but often put into a national narrative, that is a very difficult undertaking to have happen in Germany. One does not want to claim the Holocaust for a national German agenda. That is not a moment of pride for Germany, obviously. It's a moment of deep shame. And one has to be suspicious about utilizing the Holocaust for German nationalist purposes. So artists in Germany have come up with this concept of the counter-monument. It's a monument. It's certainly monumental in size, but it lacks inscriptions. It has a form that is more or less abstract. So in the case of the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, you have just a field of concrete pillars of varying height and pathways of varying depth that wander through it. There is an educational center at the end of it where one can go and read and learn about the Holocaust, but the site itself, the memorial itself, does not bear any inscription. And that leaves it to the visitor to construct the meaning of the site. So that's the role of abstraction.
Now, some of these abstractions can be relatively graphic, can't they?
Yes, you can have graphic abstractions. I think there's the famous memorial in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto, by Nathan Rappaport to the Warsaw Warsaw Ghetto Heroes. Has figures on the memorial. On one side, you have a very heroic representation of the Jewish resistance fighters during the 1943 ghetto uprising. On the other side, you have a more abstract, modernist portrayal of Jewish Warsavians being led away by the SS. So that you can certainly have figural representations, but even there's minimal inscription. And so that the meaning of the memorial in part has to be the experience of the memorial space. One has to travel there and experience it in person and understand how it's contextualized in the city, how it's placed in the cityscape.
Now, I know in your book you're looking at different different places, and obviously one of the one of the big places that people go is Auschwitz.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Auschwitz and what
Sure.
and what you.
First of all, tell us a little bit about the book.
The book,
okay.
yeah, the
Well,
book
thank
in
you.
general,
Thank you.
too.
Well, the book is nearing completion. My goal is to finish the manuscript this summer, and if all goes as planned, I think it would be in print no later than a year from now. The book deals with the phenomenon of Holocaust tourism in an age when survivors and eyewitnesses are passing from the scene, and yet the numbers of visitors to many of these Holocaust memorials is continually rising. You have over 1 million visitors per year to the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum, same at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Berlin Memorial Site has hundreds of thousands of visitors. So that's the phenomenon that the book is addressing. In terms of Auschwitz in particular, I think it in itself encapsulates, I think, the development of Holocaust memorialization over the past 7 decades. It was when Auschwitz was liberated in January of 1945 by the Red Army, there were already plans immediately in place to preserve the site as a museum, a memorial site. The Soviet Union had already liberated Majdanek and converted it into a memorial and museum before the end of the war, with the purpose of exposing the crimes of the war crimes of the Nazis. But immediately after World War II, we begin the Cold War period. And so the kind of memorial that Auschwitz first becomes is skewed largely toward a site of Polish national suffering and Soviet liberation. And scant mention is made of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. If any part of this has to do with the Marxist internationalist agenda and not wanting to draw attention to national and ethnic difference in an era of building communism. But one has to also acknowledge the ongoing existence of anti-Semitism in Europe after World War II. Beginning in the 60s, as Holocaust memory becomes more of a public phenomenon, Eichmann trial, for example, that becomes a part of public discourse, attention on Auschwitz grows, and supervision of the memorial site is also shared with an international body. And so by the 60s, Auschwitz begins to acknowledge the unique suffering of the Jewish prisoners, of the Jewish victims of the camp, and the evolution of the camp from what had begun as a political prisoners camp to the mass extermination facility at Birkenau, where over 1 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to undergo tremendous development. The end of the Cold War has meant the ability for Western tourists to travel to Auschwitz more easily. I think it's made the funding of preserving the site more robust. And now the problem that the museum and the memorial site faces is sustainability of accommodating over 1 million tourists per year at a site that is fragile in some ways. So that's an ongoing process.
Can you tell us about the trivialization of the effect by tourism per se?
Sure. I mean, this is, of course, the risk of remembering something as solemn as the Holocaust through the medium of tourism, which I think many of us are inclined to think of as frivolous even, or perhaps trivial. There's a common theme among tourists. When one is a tourist, one likes to think that one is not the same kind of tourist that everybody else is. So there is a risk. Obviously, tourism includes things like purchasing refreshments at a site like this, or paying for tour guides. So the commodification, there's a bookstore at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum, as there are at almost every other memorial site. So there's an uncomfortable proximity between commodifying the Holocaust and memorializing it and learning about it. So tourism has to walk a very fine line between education and the unavoidable commodification processes that accompany it. I think my interest in the book is to acknowledge the commodification and the trivialization that comes along with it, but ask us to also think about what potentials for preserving Holocaust memory does tourism make possible. I think there's a difference between a person who chooses to take time and travel to a remote location in Poland and spend the day at a depressing site learning about the Holocaust versus somebody who's going to a theme park. There are some critics of the facility who actually liken Auschwitz to a theme park. I personally find that characterization a little incorrect, I'll simply say. So,
up until now, how is that balance between making it a commodity and memorialization handled? Are those decisions handled by committees or individuals, or
the place in the case of Auschwitz, again, the site is so internationally well known and also managed and overseen by an international body, and that's the decision-making body at the place. At less well-known memorial sites of the Holocaust, it's really up to the local community to establish the kind of memorial that they want to have and determine how it's managed. And in some places, that kind of management is more effective than others, but at other places you will have poorly maintained facilities, frankly, and the selling of tickets. There's obviously an economic interest in the site, and yet the product, if you will, is not necessarily of the same caliber or the same quality from locale to locale. So it's a process that I think as time goes on in Europe, and again, I think because of the moment where we are with the passing of the generation of survivors and witnesses, there's a sense of urgency in preserving and recovering many of the sites that have been neglected over these years. So, for example, the site Treblinka and Sobibor have pretty extensive archaeological work underway right now, trying to preserve those sites then for future generations, where neglect may have been a better characteristic of what was taking place, certainly at Sobibor.
Now, with physical places that you have mentioned, the places themselves are the memorial. Are you saying that aspects that are highlighted convey opinions, or are you saying that signage conveys opinions?
I would say, I think opinion, certainly signage conveys opinion. I think, and sometimes they convey fact and erroneous misinformation. The placard that was originally at Auschwitz-Birkenau misrepresents the number of dead at Auschwitz as, I think, 4 million. We know that's not the correct number, but it also does not characterize the demographics of the group. In Sobibor, a plaque overestimates the number of dead from Sobibor, but also claims them to be primarily Polish Catholic victims. So again, the absence of acknowledging the Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. That is certainly conveyed through signage, but sites also convey information through juxtaposition, through the positioning of pictures, historical photos on site that inform tourists of the place, and ask tourists also to think about where they are now standing in relationship to the image that they're looking at the camp.
In dealing with the various sites, how do they handle killing fields and forest sites and things like that? And I can understand the camps more than I can understand those things.
That's very interesting. I mean, of course, half of the victims of the Holocaust died in shootings in forests in Eastern Europe, and so episodes like Babi Yar being the most famous or infamous. But that certainly was something that occurred throughout Eastern Europe. Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, I think, talks quite extensively about that aspect of the Holocaust during that era. But there were killing fields at many of the campsites as well. So Belzec, for example, there were mass burial pits that were just simply neglected. Or places where at Treblinka there was the so-called clinic where prisoners were shot and then thrown immediately into a mass burial pit. And at many of these sites, they were covered over, they were erased. There was an attempt made by the Nazis at the end of the war to cover these sites over to remove any evidence of their having existed. And one could still walk through these places and find artifacts related to what had transpired there. I think, again, one sees intense interest in preserving these sites. My concern about some of the recovery of these sites is that what we lose in the process is the history of having forgotten, almost willful forgetfulness that has accompanied them. So Belzec is a very good example of a site that had a memorial placard, but very little that marked the terrain and explained what facilities were where and what incidents during the Holocaust took place at the site. Starting in the 90s, visitors to the site were disturbed by the lack of preservation, and now there's a very new memorial installation at Belzec that is very impressive and very instructive. It includes a learning center, but at the same time, the new installation erases the evidence of neglect and the effort to forget. And I think that's just as much an important part of the history of Holocaust memory in Europe, and as is the physical commemoration.
Dan, in many museums now, it's not uncommon for people to have earphones and listen to pre-recorded information. Right. How do you view that?
I think that facilitates the educational purpose of these installations. I think this is part of the discomfort one has with tourism. It's a profane activity at a site that is for many sanctified by the suffering of the victims. And so how to balance the sense of reverence that one wants to bring to the place, and yet one is aware that one has all the trappings of tourism worn around one's neck. It's distracting at times.
Does this connect in any way to U.S. Civil War battlegrounds? I mean, it sounds like the same kind of issues come up.
I think there are some similar issues. I think of course, the Civil War, the reenactments, and all of that. The Civil War, I think we seem to have collectively speaking, a greater comfort with that kind of manifestation when the event lies further in the past. I think with the Holocaust still as part of living memory, and of course with the calamitous moment in the 20th century that it represents, the level of discomfort with that kind of preservation of memory is more intense. Thankfully, one does not see reenactments, any efforts to, there's not a desire or an effort at most of the sites that I'm aware of trying to give the visitor a sense of what it was like, or to simulate in somehow the experience. That would be deeply disturbing. There are other places, for example, if one goes to the Wolfschanz, Hitler's bunker facility in Poland, you can pause and have your picture taken next to an artillery gun from World War II with somebody dressed in a uniform. And there's I find that somewhat distasteful. But nevertheless, even in the absence of reenactments, one has tourists with cameras and taking flash photos in exhibitions that, for example, the human hair that's on display in Auschwitz, even though one is instructed not to take photos and not to use flash, tourists don't always follow the rules.
Or even understand the language that the rules are in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very true.
Dan, are there any displays of religiosity on these sites, and how do you view that?
Sure. Well, there are, and this is speaking in the context of the extermination camps that were located on ground that is today in Poland. There is certainly there are efforts to commemorate the Jewish victims, and one sees the Star of David. Many of the visitors will laid votive candles and placed stones on top of memorials in commemoration. But the presence of crosses is also very prevalent. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, one had a cloister that was in the building that was originally used to store the belongings of new deportees to Auschwitz, and a Carmelite cloister that eventually created such a scandal that the Pope John Paul II, had to ask the nuns to please vacate the space, which they thankfully did. But that tension in Poland between the Catholic Poles, who did many of whom did suffer at the hands of the Nazis, and the overwhelming number of Jewish victims at these sites still plays out. It's still uncomfortable in Poland, I think.
You know, if one knows, for instance, that any particular ethnic community is going to want to commemorate something, is there an obligation for the directors of these sites to make provisions for that commemoration?
Well, I think there is. I think there has to be some awareness of who will be visiting the site, and what is an appropriate way to make space for commemoration that is meaningful and yet does not encroach on the experience of visitors for whom the site may have a very different meaning. And so it's a fine line to walk. I'm not sure there's always an easy answer to it. I don't think that it's ever a tension that can be fully resolved. I actually think that might also be one of the values in the experience of touring a place like that, is that one experiences this tension of appropriate ways of commemorating, whether in a religious tradition or because of one's own ethnicity, that one has a sense of history really still being up for grabs by different agendas or by different communities. And I think the tourist is then asked to think about one's own responsibility for history and the right way to commemorate it.
So in Israel, clearly that's a big issue at Yad Vashem.
Yes.
You can talk about that a little bit, about how Yad Vashem works and
Sure.
some of those issues that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate to travel to Yad Vashem last September, thanks to the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities as well as Grinnell College, and have been intensely interested in the place for quite some time, and knew that I needed to experience it in person to understand the nature of its commemoration of the Holocaust and how it represented that history to tourists. I found it located on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, on a beautiful, somewhat very quiet, less developed hilltop in Jerusalem, surrounded by other parts of the city. A very quiet and reflective space, very beautiful in a way that most Holocaust memorial sites don't aspire to be. The museum itself is constructed as an axis that travels from a subterranean point and then emerges at the end with a vista of Israel, of Jerusalem. And it's a very inspiring experience, actually, to go from the beginnings of this exhibit to the foundation of the State of Israel. Clearly, the Yad Vashem, to the tourist who is, and many of us are not as aware of Israeli politics, Israeli history, and I think the takeaway for many such tourists at Yad Vashem is that the founding of the State of Israel is intimately linked or causally related to the Holocaust. And of course, one of the tensions of this is that by drawing so much attention to the establishment of the State of Israel after the Holocaust, it tends to ignore the longer history of Zionism, but also the 3,000-year history of Jews in the Holy Land. And so there is a tension there at Yad Vashem. I'm not sure that the average tourist is going to be made aware of that. I think it's something that is not, the site itself does not draw attention to that. But of course, tourists can inform themselves before they go on sites. So there's nothing about tourism that precludes that kind of awareness also.
Do you have any impressions of how the material is laid out in Yad Vashem particularly?
Yeah, well, I again, I found it a tremendously moving site. I think one of the things that struck me at Yad Vashem, there's a tendency in memorial sites about the Holocaust to avoid sentimentalization, understandably. One doesn't want to exploit the Holocaust for cheap sentimentality. And yet there are some displays at Yad Vashem that are utterly devastating and moving. When one first walks in, one sees a video play, a newsreel of Jewish families waving to the camera from Europe. The films were from Europe, from life in Europe. And then, of course, the Holocaust begins. And there are several instances where newsreels are shown, newsreel footage is shown in very large format display. For me, the most devastating were the scenes from the Warsaw Ghetto, which focus on children starving to death and a sister holding her brother who apparently has just died and expired in her arms. That kind of thing it's just overwhelming. It makes the Holocaust very alive, but not in a way that I can't in any way characterize as sentimentalizing the Holocaust. And I think what Yad Vashem does for me very well is it balances an historical narrative of the Holocaust with a sense of the suffering that requires us to feel. We can't just approach this purely intellectually without any sense of compassion and empathy. And I think that that's something that is handled very well on the site.
The museum at Yad Vashem, unlike others in more remote parts of the world, has literally artifacts and reconstructions of those artifacts.
Right.
How powerful do you find that to be?
I find those powerful. I think the one that stands out in my mind the most is the deportation memorial at Auschwitz, which has a boxcar, the kind of train car that victims were transported to the camps in, and many of whom died in transport because of the horrible conditions in the boxcars. This boxcar is on a railroad that is projected over a chasm and simply stops, and it's a very dramatic representation of the deportation experience. I find that kind of there's an aesthetic kind of quality to that I find appropriate at Yad Vashem. If you might contrast that with the boxcar that's on display at the United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum, which actually was a target of some criticism when the museum first opened, because visitors can walk into the boxcar and step out of it on the other side. Well, none of the deportees could walk into the boxcar and step out on the other side and have the boxcar to themselves. It presents itself as an experiential aspect of the Holocaust, but of course does not in any way convey what the experience of the boxcar would have been like. So I think one has to be careful with the use of artifacts.
At the museum in D.C., one can circumvent going through it, which is a useful thing.
Yes.
Because we were down there once with German National who didn't want to go through it.
I think there are people for whom, there is something about seeing that car, and that, of course, it's a boxcar that was used in deportations. Yeah. And knowing that artifact has a direct connection with the event that one is witnessing is very powerful. Again, the obligation falls to the individual tourist to decide what to navigate one's relationship to that artifact. And I think certainly I can understand how for a German tourist and for many other tourists as well, certainly Jewish tourists as well, might find that overpowering.
So I'm not sure whether they had planned in the alternate route when they first constructed the area, but I suppose they found it was necessary for some people, for whatever reason, could not bear to go through it.
No, I'm certain that's the case. Yeah.
And talking about abstract art again and memorials, how do we know how people react to that abstraction?
I think that's a study, and I don't pretend to answer that particular question in my book, but I do. It's a question that I hope that I'm raising, and I think it will fall to other scholars in the future to do some of the empirical work about gauging and quantifying the kinds of reactions that tourists have. I think, though, that there is a lot of documentation in this era of blogging and tweeting and Facebook. People make their experiences known very publicly, and one can have access to a wide range of experiences. Even something, a site as trivial, or, well, I don't want to knock the site in any way as being trivial, but as common as TripAdvisor, where people will document their experiences, shows you a wide range of responses to the sites. Some of them reflect a great deal of reflection, and others sort of are somewhat short and cursory. So
Now, when you deal with an abstraction, do we have any idea whether the abstraction is able to communicate to children as well as adults?
well, I think that is the challenge of abstraction, and this is the abstraction again is the avenue that many of these counter monuments take in an effort not to impose a message on the viewers. The risk of that, of course, is to impose no message on the inattentive viewer or on the viewer who is simply not ready yet to do the kind of work of thinking about abstraction, and I would include young children at Holocaust memorial sites. So I think that's why you see at many such sites an educational center located nearby, because the memorial itself can't do the work of conveying a particular message, and yet that message must be conveyed.
Well, so in that light, we can talk about 6 million paper clips and some of the American memorials.
Right.
What do you think about some of the American memorials and ideas like that? How do they work?
Well, I think I think it's the 6 million paper clips idea is it's a fascinating effort, I think, to begin to think about the dimensions of the Holocaust. Obviously, one of the incomprehensible aspects of the Holocaust, the number of 6 million dead, is something that it's a number that mystifies, it boggles the mind. What does none of us, I think, can fathom what that the totality of suffering that number conveys. It's a number that overwhelms, and I think this effort at 6 million, gathering 6 million paper clips, is not an effort to understand the number 6 million. It's an effort to understand the enormity of suffering and the incomprehensibility of comprehending these numbers. That ultimately I think the path to understanding the Holocaust can't be in trying to make sense of a magnitude. I think it has to be in the obligation and at the same time I think impossibility of doing this and of acknowledging each individual victim of the Holocaust.
Now, Dan, you've seen the memorial we have here. What impression does it make upon you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the memorial here in Des Moines. I think it's an incredibly well conceived, beautifully designed memorial that is also very appropriate for the site. I think there is some abstraction that takes place at this memorial, and I think it's appropriate. I think the four walls winding that sort of form a winding pathway provide a kind of historiography of the Holocaust and invite the viewer to walk in and become informed and to educate oneself. But the walls are covered with inscriptions, and the inscriptions ask to be read and ask the viewer to think about what they're saying. And so it's a site with a very clear pedagogical agenda. And I think that's when one thinks about the Holocaust, Des Moines may not be the first place that many people associate with the Holocaust. Of course, there is a large Jewish community in Des Moines, or a substantial survivor community that once lived in Des Moines, and there is a connection, and liberators also who are living in Des Moines. So for the site to establish the connection between the local experience of the Holocaust and the remote event, I think the memorial does a very good job of explaining that.
Thank you. Tell us more about the book. What are the parameters of the book?
Well, the book is divided into two sections. I've divided it by type of site that tourists typically go to encounter Holocaust history. So the first half of the book is devoted to tourism at the concentration camps, primarily the extermination camps in Poland. And in that first half, I'm asking sort of abstract questions about what kinds of thinking do tourists do? How do tourists engage with the site? How is there a way to think about tourism as a form of witnessing, which I think has an ethical component that the word tourism itself would not convey? And if there is witnessing taking place, what is being witnessed? I think, obviously, the Holocaust itself is receded into the past, but there's the traces of it and the memory of it and how that memory is cared for comes before the tourist as something to be witnessed. I also ask about tourist behavior. What does it mean to take a photograph? Tourists take photographs. That's what we do as tourists. We wear cameras. Well, what does that mean when you take pictures at a place like Auschwitz or a place like Treblinka? What does the camera do in facilitating or making more difficult the act of reflection about the Holocaust? I think when one thinks about the role of photography during the Holocaust and the presence of documentary photography on display at the Holocaust, there's a way in which photography, if a tourist is taking pictures, you can't help but question your relationship to the perpetrators who took the pictures in many instances, or to the liberators who took the pictures upon liberation. And most of the pictures we have from the Holocaust, from the camps, were taken either by perpetrators or by liberators, almost never by the victims, by the inmates.
So are there specific memorials that you think are more directed at liberators that are particularly appropriate for that or aimed at that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the camp memorials in Poland were primarily, and also many of the camps in Germany that would have been under Western control during the Cold War, certainly drew more attention to the role of liberators, whether it was in the Eastern Bloc to the role of the Red Army as liberators, or at places like Dachau or not Buchenwald, that would have been in the East, but Dachau or I'm going to draw a blank, but or Mauthausen in Austria, for example. The role of the Allied liberators is certainly highlighted. I think an evolution has taken place at those camps to question the efficacy of liberation or the delays in liberation, and to also not let the act of liberation take center stage at the cost of the suffering of the victims. I think at Des Moines, the memorial certainly calls attention to the experience of liberators, and there are many quotes by liberators on the memorial at Des Moines, and I think. But they're contextualized. They don't have a sole claim to the space, to the engraved space on the wall. They're contextualized with the experience of survivors and other witnesses, and also with world thinkers who ask big philosophical questions for us to think about. So certainly liberation is an important dimension of Holocaust history and remembrance, and must be acknowledged. But it is a part of it. There are many other dimensions of the Holocaust experience to be commemorated.
Dan, this is 70 years after the fact. When did the construction of memorials begin, and where is it going?
Well, that's a great question. I think the one of the first memorials to be built in Warsaw after the war, the city was completely razed in 1944 by the Nazis when the rest of the city rose up in 1944. The ghetto memorial was erected in, I believe, 1946. But it also, because it was the only memorial, it became a place for commemoration of all kinds of wartime trauma. So it in some ways served multiple purposes, and even though it was designed to commemorate the ghetto heroes, it actually was appropriated for many different kinds of commemoration as well. The real boom, there are some people who speak about a boom in Holocaust memorialization. I think there are different phases of Holocaust memorialization. I think in Europe, certainly for the first 20 years or so after the Holocaust, the memory is shrouded mostly by silence. Certainly it might have been discussed in families privately, but there was no public discourse about the Holocaust. with the beginning with trials, the Eichmann trial or the trials in Germany of the Auschwitz camp guards, the topic began to be discussed much more publicly, so to such an extent that by 1968, when we have this tremendous generation conflict playing out in the streets in Germany, the generation conflict is often fought about what did my parents' generation do during the war? What was were they responsible? Were they guilty? The real shift in Holocaust memorialization, though, as something that is understood as necessary and has to take place not only in terms of memorials but in terms of school curricula and textbooks, began in the 1980s. And the context, again, with which I'm most familiar is Germany and the airing of the NBC miniseries Holocaust. Was the most widely seen television show in all of West German history up to that point. And despite one's discomfort with a network television, some would say melodrama about the Holocaust, that television show, that form of popular culture, did more to unleash conversation about the Holocaust in public fora in Germany than anything before it at that point. And so starting in the 80s, you have an effort in many cities in Germany to recover sites of Holocaust perpetration or of residences of Jewish life that once thrived. And then, of course, reunification. 1990, the end of the Cold War, and this is an international phenomenon, I think, just really is the beginning of what then people call the Holocaust, the boom, the memory boom, where sites that were previously more inaccessible are now very accessible, and the resources to preserve and maintain these sites are forthcoming now in a way they weren't before. It's no accident, of course, that, again, we are at this historical moment where of the passing of the generation of those who experienced the event, that happened simultaneously, more or less, with the end of the Cold War, I think is part of the reason why there is this tremendous development in the last 3 decades, I would say, of Holocaust memorials.
We have an event coming up April 27th.
April 27th, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Here in Des Moines, we'll have an event, people gathering at the memorial on the side of the Capitol building in Des Moines.
Western side of the Capitol.
Western side at 1 p.m., followed by a lecture by Professor Harold Kasimov from Grinnell, who is himself a survivor, and his lecture will be given at 315 East 5th Street in Des Moines, just a few blocks from the memorial itself.
And what's he talking about?
He's talking about Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust.
Okay, and then we have the synagogues are doing a joint program April 30th that's going to be held at Beth-El Jacob Synagogue on Cummins Parkway with Frank Mink, who is a former skinhead who will talk about anti-Semitism and basically overcoming that hatred and how he changed. Periodically we do various Holocaust-related events or Jewish history-related events, and I'd encourage you to kind of look into Jewish Federation website here or in the communities in which you live. Passover is coming up the beginning of next week. First Seder is Monday night, and I hope that all of you have a wonderful, happy Passover. And as you're thinking about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, you also think, and the Jewish people are supposed to think, of all the times where we've overcome difficulties in our people's past and in our families' past. We think of the difficult journeys that all of our ancestors have made, and we remember that we ourselves were there. That's the principle. We were part of each part of our history, each difficult part. We were as a people not only leaving Egypt, but we were also as a people at Auschwitz and as a people in Treblinka and as a people in Warsaw. And than we're as a people today, walking through Yad Vashem, walking through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial. So that understanding of being a part of all of Jewish history is a part of what the Passover Seder is all about. And I wish you a happy and healthy Passover, but also a very thoughtful one. And we will see you next Thursday.